Hey guys, welcome to the follow-up video for the video essay State of Mind. In a lot of ways, I am pretty proud of this video essay, certainly compared to others of mine, and yet at the same time, it contains one of the most embarrassing moments of my YouTube career thus far. And that is, in the introduction of this video, I kind of go on at some length about how excited I am that I was able to edit this video in a way that I believed was resulting in a higher quality experience, only to later discover, once I had uploaded the video to YouTube, that the video essay portion suddenly became very glitchy and fuzzy. I tried in a few different ways to figure out if there was a way to fix that, and nothing I tried really worked. So I ended up just letting the video exist as is, and yeah, that's why it's pretty embarrassing, is that you go from me rambling on about how good the quality of this video is supposed to be into a much lower quality video essay section than my last few videos had been. Obviously, a lot of my much earlier videos are also pretty low quality, but the difference with those is I don't spend multiple minutes talking about how good the quality is going to be before you see just how bad the quality actually is. So with that in mind, I do, as usual, encourage you guys to have watched that video prior to watching the rest of this one. But in this case, please do feel free to use the time codes in the description of that video to skip into the actual video and skip past me talking it up. But yeah, I'll put the link to that right up here and in the description to this video. As discussed fully in this channel's Underworld video, I believe the Egyptian settlers that arrived on the island came to worship the smoke monster, in no small part due to its apparent ability to bring forth the spirits of the dead. I believe over the course of several generations, this culture completed his donkey wheel, built a temple to worship him, created at least one chamber which could be used to summon him, constructed a vast series of underground tunnels, and most importantly, experimented on the source in an effort to free him from its hold. So the first comment that I want to address is from Show Costs, and there are actually two parts to this that I want to talk about. Starting with, I disagree that the Egyptians built the temple, besides maybe the foundation and the pool of light. Because it is, like you said, the Egyptians worshipped the smoke monster and built the tunnels for it to travel. But I disagree that they built the temple. The temple includes a lot of Asian features with Hindu iconography and Hindu temple architecture. There's a statue of Brahma there, and a mural of possibly Durga. It's a goddess with 10 arms and several heads. Could be someone else, because Hinduism often had gods and goddesses with several arms and heads. My headcanon is that the Egyptians built the chamber, and maybe even the pool of light, with Hindus building the main structure around it. Hieroglyphs are there in a few places, in the same way Dharma used hieroglyphs. So it's a cyclical nature, since Dharma was also notorious for building on top of ancient sites. So the first thing that I want to say in response to that is that I do have a real tendency to oversimplify the civilization that I believe worshipped the man in black into the Egyptians. But as I have discussed in the past, I believe in my follow-up video to Underworld, in which I believe I addressed the cuneiform that exists alongside hieroglyphs on the stone plug that Desmond removes from the source. I believe it was in that video where I discussed all of that, and I discussed how I agree with the conclusion that many people have that the island originally existed in the Mediterranean Sea. And this is why groups such as Romans, Egyptians, etc., found the island so often in historical times, because the Mediterranean Sea obviously exists right in the middle of all of those ancient civilizations. So prior to the Man in Black becoming the smoke monster, there was obviously the Romans, from which Jacob and the Man in Black were born. And there was also, presumably, at least one more group that Mother came with, which may have been from ancient Greece or maybe just another group of Romans. But then, after the events that we see depicted in the Across the Sea episode, in which Mother is killed and the Man in Black becomes the smoke monster, it is after those events that the ancient Egyptians arrived. And since I've already talked to death what all of the evidence for that is in the Underworld video and its follow-up, I won't do a full recap of that here, but there are a number of things that suggest that and suggest that the Egyptians worshipped the smoke monster. But as I discussed with the cuneiform, I do think that other groups besides the Egyptians also arrived on the island during this period, and with each group, I think that their beliefs were also exploited by the Man in Black, and they too came to worship the monster. And basically, you have this new society and civilization that kind of forms as an amalgamation of these other civilizations that each group has come from. And that's why cuneiform is on the stone plug along with the hieroglyphs. I do think it's also worth mentioning that with each group of settlers, I do think that there were subsets of people that didn't like the direction that their fellow community members were going down, and I do think that each one kind of split off and in my head formed another society on a different part of the island. And that this group, which also became an amalgamation of previous civilizations, was the one that Jacob became familiar with, and the one that is depicted in his tapestry. But now that I've clarified that I do have a problem of oversimplifying this civilization as Egyptian, Shokos was correct that I was not picking up on the Hindu iconography and especially not the Asian architecture that is present in the main temple. In fact, that mural that he mentioned, I had never noticed, and I had to ask him to tell me exactly where to find that, which he did. And so now my headcanon has been updated somewhat in that I now believe that the Egyptians and the Sumerian or Babylonian settlers, which would have used the cuneiform, I do believe that those two groups at least found the island after the Man in Black became the smoke monster, but before it was moved out of the Mediterranean Sea. So during that period, I think that the Egyptians pretty quickly built the structure around the healing spring. And it would also have been during this period that the tunnels would at least have been started, and most importantly, that the Man in Black's donkey wheel would have been completed by them. And at this stage, the island would have been moved for the first time. At which point, it may have ended up somewhere south of Asia, and a group of Hindu settlers may have discovered the island at that point, and ultimately merged with the community present on the island. And if you look at a lot of Hindu beliefs, and indeed that mural that Shokas pointed out is a perfect example of this, I think it's really easy to see how the Man in Black could have exploited those beliefs in a way that quickly convinced these settlers to regard the monster as a god. And I think after this point is when the temple would have been built. Because as Shokas agreed, there doesn't actually seem to be any of that Hindu iconography or architecture present in the temple spring or pool area itself, which, if you pay attention, the pool isn't actually located in the temple proper. They have to cut through a courtyard behind the temple to get to this separate structure where the pool is. So Shokas and I agree that it's perfectly feasible that the structure around the temple spring was built first, and then much later the temple and its walls were added on around that temple spring. And I do feel I should add that in my mind, this occurs over many centuries. So, there are these groups of settlers that arrive at different times and then kind of meld into this island civilization. But I think there are many, many generations of this civilization that exist during this period. But then when you finally get to the point where this civilization was gone, again, that's where I have often oversimplified it into the Egyptians. But really, at this point, it was basically its own thing. And again, I think there were really two groups on the island. And I think Jacob's group he sent away, which again I think is depicted in the tapestry. And that he did this when things reached a point where the Man in Black's society had been experimenting on the source and building those structures and the stone plug that we see in that cave in the series finale. And basically things got to such a point where Jacob could not ignore this any longer and had to step in and remove access to the source from his brother, and basically reconceal it the way Mother had once concealed it from them both. So anticipating the dangerous rage this could throw the Man in Black into, I think Jacob sent his people away. And I think the rage that the Man in Black felt by what he sees as another extreme betrayal by his brother, this indeed throws him into a horrific rage, during which he massacres every living person remaining on the island except for Jacob, those being the ones that followed him. But I think in that moment, he does view that as a punishment of Jacob. To the Man in Black, these people were only ever means to an end, and they weren't ever really worth moral consideration. And yet Jacob has chosen people, humanity, over his own brother. And so in that moment, that is kind of the greatest punishment that the monster could inflict on Jacob, is just killing everybody that he's able to kill. Anyways, I'm kind of over-explaining all of that again, just because in my head I'm worried that somebody might watch this and have no idea what I'm referring to. And so I'm feeling the need to go over a lot of that again, even though it's not overly relevant to the point. But moving on to the other part of Shokas's comment that I wanted to talk about, he says, one weakness of the Man in Black that many fans would add is large quantities of water. I know that he can stand in water, such as when he's found on Hydra Island and eats fruit with no problem. But there's been debate about water and how it affects him. I remember some people thinking that when Jack threw him in the water, after listening to Sawyer's advice in The Candidate, it kind of lowered his, how do we say, smoky bar. And that perhaps he needed to recharge a little bit when he got to the dock before he would be able to turn to smoke. Which is why he shoots Whitmore's goons with a gun instead of simply turning into smoke and dealing with them immediately. Or do you think that Sawyer's advice about throwing him in the water would never have worked because Sawyer assumes that water is a weakness after the man in black told him he couldn't get to Hydra Island in smoke form? And Sawyer regarded that information as important. I am not sure what I agree with, but maybe you have a perspective on that scene especially. So at the time that Shokos commented this, I had also reached a place where I didn't have a particularly strong opinion either way, at least not about the man in black being able to traverse over the water. And at this point, I didn't really have an opinion about if, when Jack pushes him into the water, if perhaps that did prevent him from turning into smoke. Now, shortly after this discussion, I did kind of think of some things that made me form more of an opinion, and I'll get to that in a bit. But first, I want to talk about, what I said in this conversation, which was that even like in that specific scene at the dock, at that time, I didn't really have an opinion of whether or not the man in black could turn into the smoke monster, because in my mind it didn't really matter if he could or couldn't. Either way, he had a good reason not to. The man in black's plan to kill the candidates very much required that they leave him behind in a hurry, because in order for his plan to work, they had to discover the bomb before the timer hit 0. Because remember, the only reason the bomb actually goes off is because Sawyer pulls the wires. If he hadn't pulled the wires, then the bomb would not have gone off. Which means if they hadn't discovered the bomb until after the timer had hit 0, they wouldn't really have the same incentive to pull the wires. They could fairly safely assume that the bomb wasn't going to go off. But at the same time, if the people already inside the sub discovered the bomb before they had left the dock, then they could still simply throw it overboard. So the man in black really needed to manufacture a scenario in which they leave in a hurry. And by acting like he's distracted by these shooters, that's how he accomplishes that. So again, even if he could turn into smoke, I don't think he would have. But at this time, I didn't really have an opinion on whether or not the water actually did affect him in some kind of negative way. Now, the thing that I did think about in the next month or two after this conversation, and I believe I commented on one of Shokas's videos about this. Basically, it occurred to me that there are multiple times that we know the monster was active in his smoke form during thunderstorms. And therefore, he's obviously getting wet in his smoke form. And as far as we can tell, it's having no negative effect on him. There's the example in the pilot when he attacks the cabin of the plane and kills the pilot, and then chases Jack, Kate, and Charlie. All of that occurs in the rain. And then in season 3, when Kate and Juliet are handcuffed to each other, there is another thunderstorm that night when they are again chased by the monster. And so given those examples, I think it's pretty clear that water doesn't really have a negative effect on him in his smoke form, and therefore he probably could indeed have turned into the smoke monster on that dock. Now, as far as whether or not he can traverse over water in smoke form, that's the part that I still don't really have a strong opinion on. I think it makes sense that he tells Sawyer that because he is trying to con Sawyer into thinking that he can somehow get an upper hand on this formidable entity. Like, the man in black needs to convince Sawyer that there's a way that he can do what the man in black actually wants him to do. But that said, just because he wants to lead Sawyer to that conclusion doesn't necessarily mean that the conclusion is wrong. perhaps in the process of manipulating Sawyer, what he is revealing about himself is actually true. That's the part that I don't really have a strong opinion on. I will say that, as I have discussed in the past, it does seem like the Man in Black can teleport within the perimeter of the island. There are many instances in which manifestations of the Man in Black that seem to be 100% corporeal do instantly disappear, and in some cases suddenly reappear in another area. I think the best example that comes to mind is in the Dead is Dead episode, Beneath the Temple. The monster retreats into the altar, and then all of a sudden it appears as Alex behind Ben. And then after the Alex manifestation threatens Ben, she suddenly disappears, and then pretty quickly afterwards, John reappears at the hole that Ben fell through. Another example is the Man in Black in the 1800s handing Richard the crucifix, which tells us that he is probably physically present in that moment. But then when Richard looks up from the cross, the Man in Black is suddenly nowhere around. And there are many other examples along these same lines. But my point is that, yeah, it does seem that the Man in Black can teleport within the realm of the island. And therefore, it stands to reason that the Man in Black, even if he can't technically float over the water, he could teleport from the main island to Hydra Island. So what's clear is that he is misleading Sawyer to some degree. Now, if people want to still believe that the monster can't turn into smoke and float over the water, that's the one specific detail that I really don't have an opinion on. Like, if you want to believe that, I have no problem with people believing that. But to me, it doesn't really matter if he can or can't.
One can imagine this potentially creating an interesting effect, in which these collected identities, each of which with their own conflicting wants and desires, may have made it difficult for the Man in Black to keep his sense of self.
Yet, the only real hint of this we get in the series, besides certain mannerisms, is when the Man in Black yells Locke's signature catchphrase without a hint of irony.
Don't tell me what I can't do. Don't tell me what I can't do!
After having just mocked this very behavior earlier that same morning.
Because when John first came to the island, he was a very sad man. A victim. Shouting at the world for being told what he couldn't do, even though they were right.
But all things considered, this is a pretty minor incident of confused identity. The reason I think the Man in Black does a pretty good job overall of avoiding these identity crises is because by the time he started replicating others, he had spent far longer than they had ever lived, completely alone in his awful state of existence. Meaning that even after downloading the entirety of what made someone else who they were, their hopes, their fears, and even their suffering all paled in comparison to his own.
The next comment I want to address comes from Time Gentleman, who says, regarding the Man in Black's "Don't tell me what I can't do," it could just be a writer's flourish to show that he is in a similar psychological state to classic Locke. Other characters have also said this phrase, perhaps most strikingly Jack to Sun in Do No Harm, when he is fretfully and stubbornly trying to save Boone's life. So I don't disagree that that was the intent on the writer's part. However, in universe, the difference between this and those other examples is that the Man in Black was perfectly well aware that this was basically a catchphrase of Locke's, and the Man in Black had just, earlier that morning, mocked Locke for this, for always saying this thing. So for him to then say it later that same day, quite sincerely, and seemingly lacking the self-awareness to realize the irony there, I think the only way that that makes sense in the context of the story is that in this moment, the man in black is so disturbed by Jacob's appearing to him, he kind of loses himself a bit. And in that moment, a bit more of the personality of the form he has taken slips through instead. Again, I think generally the man in black is very self-assured and does a fantastic job of keeping track of who he is and keeping the identities he accumulates separate. But I think what this scene shows us, not just in the man in black, kind of having this Locke moment, but also in how he trips and falls down, I think this is all meant to show us just how unsettled he is by this boy appearing to him.
The temple massacre seems to indicate the ash on its own is not enough. Once Dogen has died, the monster is suddenly able to roam the entirety of the temple, paying no mind to the multiple ash boundaries that would still have remained.
You realize what you just did? He was the only thing keeping it out! Idiot! You just let it in!
Given this, I feel it is safe to conclude that the ash does not have a significant effect on the man in black, unless there is somebody on the other side with the ability to power it, so to speak. In other words, someone that is capable of harnessing the electromagnetic energy in such a way that they can generate the necessary amount of interference from the ash.
This next comment comes from Homo sapiens 99, who says, I like the idea of the ash needing a wielder, but if that's the case, why was there a break in the ash around the cabin when Alana's group visited it, since the cabin was unoccupied at that time? And why did Bram specifically call it out as if it was something alarming? What I believe the first part of that question is asking is, why would the man in black bother breaking the ash if he would be able to go inside when there was nobody there? And the answer to that question, at least in my mind, is that ash circle around the cabin, obviously that was put there to keep the man in black out, which means that at least at some point there was something happening in that cabin that someone didn't want the man in black to be privy to. So naturally, the man in black would have an interest in finding out what that was. So not only does it make sense to me that he would want to break that perimeter, but it also makes sense that he would only want to do it in one small area where the person trying to keep him out may not even notice it. And therefore, they would think that whatever they were up to was not being observed in any way by the man in black, when in reality, he had this way of accessing the cabin. As for the second question of why Bram seemed so alarmed by the ash being broken, I really think the answer to that is the same regardless of whether or not you accept that the ash only works when someone is on the other side powering it, so to speak. In either case, the ash is meant to keep the man in black out at least some of the time, and the fact that the ash is broken definitively means that the man in black has been here. And given what they're there to do, it makes sense that this puts Bram and Ilana and their people on alert.
Once he has successfully copied a person, though, he is then able to assume their form perfectly, meaning he can appear 100% physically present in that form, able to be interacted with by anyone or any group that comes across him.
Next, I want to address a comment from Engine CD. I'm going to start with the last thing that they say, and then I'll go back to the earlier portion of their comment. What's up with Christian's corpse being gone, but not Locke's, after the man in black takes each of their forms? So in the case of Christian, obviously the man in black leads Jack to the caves and to that coffin, and Jack sees that it's empty, and I think that the whole point of that is that the man in black wants to, in Jack's mind, give credibility to the idea that if he ever were to see the Christian apparition again, that actually is his father. If Jack had found the body of his father after chasing around this manifestation of him, I think Jack then would have been completely convinced that what he was seeing was a hallucination. But by leading Jack to the empty coffin, then the Man in Black is leaving open the option for him to exploit that Christian manifestation to manipulate Jack specifically. And while the Man in Black does kind of sit on that for a long time, he did in fact end up capitalizing on it eventually. In season 5, right before Locke turns the wheel and leaves the island in order to try and convince the Oceanic Six to come back, the Man in Black, as Christian, tells Locke to tell his son, Christian's son, that he says hello. As we know, Locke is able to piece together that he was referring to Jack. And so when Locke tells Jack that his father says hello, we learn that this is the seed that grows in Jack's mind that ultimately makes him adamant that they have to go back to the island, even though obviously that was the opposite of what he ever wanted to do before that. And I think this change in Jack would not have happened if he hadn't experienced what he had that first week on the island, where he was seeing his father walk around the island and where he found the coffin was empty. If those things hadn't happened all the way back at the beginning of the series, Jack would not have become convinced that they had to go back. And by extension, it's likely that no one else would have either. So the short answer for why the Man in Black hid Christian's body is that he wanted to give more legitimacy to that manifestation. And I think this is also why when Echo looks for his brother's body in the plane in season 3, he discovers that it's no longer there. Now, the interesting thing about the Yemi situation, though, and I'm not sure like how often this has been pointed out in the past, but there's a weird discrepancy in that case, and that is that when John is time traveling in the season 5 premiere, he ends up in what we eventually find out is the year 2007. This is the scene where the future Richard takes the bullet out of John's leg. And in that scene, when John looks into the plane, Yemi's body is there again. And so this raises the far stranger question of why on earth would the Man in Black bother putting Yemi back in the plane? My explanation for this is that the Man in Black never actually moved Yemi's body, and that in Echo's state, which I've talked about quite a bit in other videos, at this time, Echo is seeing a lot of things that the Man in Black or the monster is making him see. And so I think that when Echo moves the boulder away from the plane entrance and then looks inside, I think that Yemi's body is still there, but the Man in Black is able to exert enough influence over Echo's mind at this point that Echo just doesn't see it. If you go back and watch that episode, at no point do we see Locke or anybody else look inside the plane and confirm that Yemi's body is not there. Now, if somebody else has another explanation or an explanation they think is better for why Yemi's body seems to disappear from that plane and then later reappear there, I'm certainly open to other ideas, but that's the only one that makes any kind of sense to me. In any case, I think the reason that both Christian's body and Yemi's body seem to disappear is to give those apparitions more legitimacy in the minds of the people that the Man in Black is trying to deceive. Which brings us to the question of why Locke's body wasn't also hidden. And my explanation for that is just simply that they were on Hydra Island, and there weren't exactly many options for where he could quickly hide a body. Nor do I think in his mind he felt it was particularly necessary to do so. In a manner of speaking, the body was already hidden. But yeah, on the main island, the Man in Black really has a lot of options for where he could hide bodies. I think the best example that immediately comes to mind is the underground tunnels that we know exist throughout the main island, and which we know the monster is often seen emerging from. But again, in the case of Hydra Island, he didn't really have those options, and I'm not sure how realistically he could have moved the body without being noticed by the Ajira passengers. So in that case, I think it was much less risky for him to simply leave the body in the cargo hold, where it was extremely unlikely that anybody would find it until it was too late. I think Alana and her group only found the body because it occurred to them that they should look for it, given what they knew about the Man in Black and the fact that this man seems to have come back from the dead. In the episode The Life and Death of Jeremy Bentham, when the Man in Black as Locke is on the beach and Alana comes and talks to him, the last thing that he says to her in that conversation is that he remembers dying. And I think if Ilana and her group hadn't already suspected that he was the Man in Black, I think that certainly did it. At which point it would obviously occur to them that they should check for the body. And once they found it, that's when they knew they needed to get the body to Richard as quickly as possible so that the Man in Black couldn't deceive Richard and the others into doing what he wants them to do. As we know, the Man in Black and Ben leave Hydra Island before Ilana and her group find the guns. And so Ilana's group has to play catch up once they do find the guns and leave Hydra Island. And even then, it is indeed too late to stop the Man in Black from successfully killing Jacob. They do succeed in exposing him to that group of others, and therefore prevent them from continuing to be manipulated by him. But yeah, all things considered, I think that the Man in Black leaving Locke's body where it was probably the best strategy, especially if he didn't know what Alana and her group were there to do, which he may or may not have.
By leaving a small amount of himself in the summoning pool, he could then sense when it was drained and decide to heed the call.
I believe he did the same thing to the spring, but to a larger degree, when the Egyptians first built the temple. And that is essentially what I think the infection is. I think a separated piece of the smoke monster enters a mortally wounded host in the process of healing them, after which it begins to grow inside of them and compel their behavior in a way that serves the Man in Black's interests.
Okay, so now I want to go back to the first part of Engine CD's comment, where he says, the Man in Black being able to infect people via water really changes things up. He led Jack to the caves and he gave Richard water. Seems like he had plenty of opportunities of infecting candidates if he had this power. I always thought he was spiritually infecting people, like Saeed and Claire, and the only way they could come back was by other people. Such as when Desmond asked Saeed what he would say to Nadia if the Man in Black brought her back to life. That kind of made him self-reflect and yada yada yada. There is definitely something up with the Man in Black and water, but I always thought it was more symbolic than something physical. Okay, so there are a lot of things that I want to zone in on there. But first, and I think most importantly, I want to clarify something that I certainly hope was much more clear in the next video I did, which was all about the infection specifically. And that is that I do not think that the Man in Black can just infect anyone via water or anything else. I think that the person that he is infecting has to be very close to death. Because in order to infect people, specifically people that Jacob has touched or that are under Jacob's protection, I think that he has to wait until that part of Jacob's life force is dead. And then a piece of the Man in Black can enter into this host through the process of healing them, and it can then begin to grow inside them and at a certain point begin to compel their thoughts, their emotions, and in doing so, it can heavily influence their actions. I also think that he needs them to be very close to death, because that is really the scenario in which they are most likely to give in to this influence. As is demonstrated by Saeed, and I believe Echo, it is possible to resist this influence after being infected. And so I think the Man in Black's best chance for successfully infecting somebody is by doing so when they are basically dead. And their defenses, physically, mentally, emotionally, are all gone. Now, I'm not sure if it's even worth me mentioning this, but I also, as I have said in previous videos, and I will certainly be saying at least one more time in the future, where I really go into this, I really do not think that the Man in Black wanted Saeed to kill Desmond. I think there's another reason that the Man in Black sends him off to the well. And so while what Desmond says to Saeed may or may not have successfully influenced him not to do what he was being compelled to do in that situation, I think in that case, Saeed wasn't actually being compelled to do it. That said, there obviously is a much better example of Saeed genuinely resisting and breaking free of the Man in Black's influence, and that is the moment where he takes the bomb on the submarine and runs away from the other candidates with it. This, of course, saves the lives of multiple candidates, which obviously is very much against what the Man in Black would have wanted to happen. And lastly, when Engine CD says that he always thought of the infection as something more spiritual or symbolic than something physical, I wanted to say that I really don't think that those things are mutually exclusive. In other words, just because I tend to explain things in a more tangible sense, that is never meant to diminish the more spiritual or symbolic aspects of the story. Indeed, that's the exact opposite of what I'm actually trying to do. I don't know if that's something that a lot of people would find surprising or not, but I could see how people could come to the conclusion that because I do tend to focus on more rational explanations for things, that means that I have no appreciation for the spiritual aspects of the show. And again, that is actually the opposite of the truth. It would probably take me an entire video's worth of rambling to try and explain what I mean. But to me, things like this aren't mutually exclusive. You can understand scientifically why some real world phenomenon happens, and that doesn't necessarily make it any less miraculous. And it doesn't make the idea of believing in something else beyond that, it doesn't make that any less valid. That's how I feel about the real world. And so when it comes to Lost and the story that it's telling and the themes that it's dealing with, I certainly believe that about this show. So with something like the infection, I 100% agree that the monster is spiritually corrupting these people, and that happening in the story is very symbolic. But that doesn't make me any less interested in explaining the internal mechanics at play for how that would physically work. I think there's a reason that a lot of people don't like the idea of something in a story just being explained away by, oh, it's just magic, or that's just how it works. I think that's why a lot of people, me included, don't like the idea of just accepting surface level explanations like Jacob and the Man in Black can't kill each other because the rules, or the monster can't leave the island because Jacob says so. and he's just magically capable of being able to make that a reality. Julian Grinblatt 955 says Terry O'Quinn as the smoke monster absolutely killed it in seasons 5 and 6. On a retrospective watch, it was immediately apparent it was not Locke anymore. So I don't really have much to add to that. I very much agree. And for what it's worth, I think John Terry also did a good job. And I want to give credit to the writers and directors, because it does seem like Terry O'Quinn specifically has said that nobody told him he was playing a completely different character until the end of season 5. And I would certainly assume that John Terry, who plays Christian, also didn't know that, which means the directors probably deserve some credit for kind of informing their performance in a way without telling them explicitly that they were actually playing a different character. But yeah, that does not diminish that Terry O'Quinn. I think Terry O'Quinn is fantastic in every scene that he's in this show and anything else that I've ever seen him in. So yeah, I think Julian's right that he's incredible as the smoke monster. I also think he's incredible as Locke. And I do think it's a shame that he's not in more things. I mean, he is in plenty of stuff, but yeah, I do think he should be a more well-known actor. There's a show that he's in that's on Amazon. It got canceled after 2 seasons. And to be honest, I didn't love the second season the way I did the first. But the show is called Patriot, and I think the first season of that show especially is one of the best seasons of television I've ever seen. And Terry O'Quinn is in that show. So if there is anybody out there that hasn't seen that and would be interested, I highly recommend you watching that. This last comment that I want to address isn't really specifically related to the State of Mind video, but this commenter did leave this on this video, and I had told him that I would address it in the massive video that I did that was basically following up a variety of comments on many different videos. But this one managed to slip through the cracks, and I didn't end up addressing it there, so I thought I should go ahead and address it now. And that comment is from Jerry Badine. As always, I apologize if I'm not pronouncing these names correctly. But he says, would love to hear your opinions on top favorite episodes or favorite characters. Also, what do you think happened after the end? Do you think Kate and Sawyer ended up together, stayed friends, or never saw each other again? So my quick response to favorite episodes and characters, I realize is kind of lame, but it's also honest. And that is that my favorite episodes and characters often fluctuate as the years go on, and as I rewatch the show each time. There are characters that I used to really dislike that, as time has gone on, I've come to appreciate a lot more. Kate is an example that comes to mind. Jack too, actually, in a lot of ways. And the same can be said for the episodes. There are episodes that I used to dislike. All the ones that I'm thinking of, they're still not among my favorite episodes, but again, I've come to appreciate at least aspects of those episodes a lot more. And the opposite can be said in some cases. There are episodes that I liked a lot when I was younger, but as I've gotten older, the flaws have become more and more noticeable to me. So all of that's to say, I don't really see much point in ranking the episodes or the characters, just because it is so subjective and it is constantly fluctuating, in my case at least. So if I were to make a video where I was ranking episodes or characters or putting them in categories, like a tier list or something like that, that might be accurate at the time I make the video, but then a year, a month, or even a week later that might no longer be accurate. Now, that's not to say I wouldn't be interested in doing a video somewhat along those lines. Like, I would actually love to talk about certain characters that I think get a lot of hate that I do not feel is justified at all. I think Michael is a great example. I've kind of talked in little bits about that. I think, yeah, people are really quick to condemn him without really thinking about his thought process and what he was going through, not empathizing with him. And again, you don't have to condone what someone does to empathize with them. So yeah, my point is, yeah, I'm not opposed to doing videos like that, but I don't think I would ever, try and give a concrete ranking of favorites. As for what I think happened after the end of the series, this is something that I'm not super interested in exploring, in my own head, and certainly not in the video format. I think that the way the series ends, it really is meant to be up to each individual viewer to kind of decide or imagine what the people that are still alive at the end of the series, what their life was like after that. And therefore, it doesn't feel necessary or even particularly appropriate for me to sit here and tell you, my story for what I think happened to them. Now, that said, I understand the appeal of doing that, and why it's fun to hear people's thoughts on these things. And for that reason, I'm not opposed to sharing a little bit of the small amount I've thought about this. Now that I've specifically been asked. And yeah, I haven't put a lot of thought into it. But the one thing that I have thought about, as I'm sure most people have, is what was Kate and Sawyer's relationship like after they left the island? Because obviously they're both still alive, presumably for many years, and their soulmates, if you will, Jack and Juliet, obviously died. So, yeah, I don't hate the idea that they actually ended up in a relationship that was actually probably pretty healthy for both of them. And maybe they even grew old together. But then, yeah, once they died, it was their actual, again, for lack of a better word, soulmates that they ended up with. I don't hate that idea at all. I don't think it's necessary for anyone to believe that they were together romantically after the end of the series. They may not have been. Now, a funny joke answer that I like to give for what I think happened at the end of the series. I'm not sure if I've already said this in a previous video. It feels like I have, but I don't know why I would have or what video that would have been in. But a funny answer that I like to give to that question about what happened to the characters that left the island on the Ajira plane. I like to joke that Kate spent the rest of her life in prison because she very clearly violated the one condition of her pretty generous parole agreement, which was that she was not allowed to leave the state of California. Again, I'm mostly joking there, but it is interesting to wonder, what her story is going to be when they get back to the real world. And not only that, but what are all of them going to tell the rest of the world, once they come back from having gone missing again? And not only that, but they're bringing back people that were on Oceanic 815 that the Oceanic 6 told the rest of the world were dead. It is interesting to think about, what is that going to be like going back and having to explain just how much of their previous story was fake. But okay, I think that's everything I have for this video. There are 2 follow-ups that I have left to do, which will basically catch me up on those. The next one is for a communicable disease, which was all about the infection. And if you guys want to watch that in preparation for the upcoming follow-up, I will also put that link up here and in the description. And then the one after that will be the Clouded Judgment follow-up. Once those two have been released, which should happen within a month at the most, that's when you're going to see me resume the Smoke and Mirrors series, which still had 3 parts left. And after that, I think from that point on, anytime you see one of these follow-up videos, it's going to be shorter, and it will focus on just 1, 2, or maybe 3 comments at a time, depending on how related those comments are, or, you know, if my response to them is very short, then yeah, I'll group multiple comments together. But yeah, I'm going to make shorter versions of these follow-ups. And the idea is that I will be able to kind of just address any comment from any video whenever I feel like it and just throw it into the playlist for that video essay. Because yeah, as I've said before, there are videos that I've already done a follow-up or follow-ups on that have continued to receive interesting feedback that I do think is worth addressing in the video format. As I've said before, just because I address something in a follow-up video, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the end of the conversation. Sometimes the back and forth continues beyond that, and I would like to be able to continue that conversation in these videos. So yeah, 2 more of these types of follow-ups, then I'm going to finish the Smoke and Mirrors video essay, and then obviously I will move on to other video essays. But yeah, that's what the follow-up, the going back sub-series, that's how these are going to kind of evolve. But all right, I hope you guys come back for the next one.
Oh, you're still here. Hopefully that means you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider sticking around and being a constant for this channel by clicking right up here to subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell icon if you would like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive. In the meantime, feel free to check out previous content from this channel by clicking here or here. Oh no. Please subscribe.